Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm Tracy Harris, and this is At Home in My Head, the podcast that explores experience and meaning and their impact on individuals and the broader society. You know, it wasn't even that long ago, maybe a year, that I started noticing this big disconnect in some of the things I was advocating for, especially when it came to empowering marginalized communities. There's always been this debate, can you really make change from inside a system of oppression, or does it have to come from the outside? Because let's be real, these systems are built to protect themselves. They're designed to reward the people who succeed within them, and to succeed, you often have to play by their rules. You have to embrace the system to some degree, even perpetuate it, to climb the ladder. And at some point, you've got to ask, if you've had to compromise so much of yourself just to get to a position of power, can you even use that power for good anymore? For the longest time, I was the person counting the lack of marginalized folks in leadership, presidents, Supreme Court justices, CEOs. It was a thing I always pointed to as proof of injustice. And it is proof. But then I started looking deeper. Learning about the UN veto system was a big eye-opener. Here's this global body that's supposed to stand for justice, but only 5 countries have the power to shut down anything they don't like. 5 out of 193 members. Russia, for example, has used its veto 129 times. The US is right behind them with 87, and more than half of those, 49, were to shield Israel. Watching US representatives at the UN trying to justify those most recent votes, honestly, it was embarrassing. But it got me thinking, if these systems can't stop war crimes or genocide until it's way too late, if they can't hold people accountable until they're either out of power or dead, then how effective are they really? And then there's the US, this country spiraling deeper into what you'd call a capitalist hellscape. Whether you call it an oligarchy, a plutocracy, or just straight up kleptocracy, it's clear. Wealthy people run the show. Poll after poll shows what the majority of us want, but policy doesn't reflect it. And it's hard not to feel like working within the system to fix it is a pipe dream. I mean, look at what happens when people try. Peaceful protests get met with police violence. Counter-protesters show up, start fights, and the blame gets pinned on the victims. Entire groups advocating for justice, blocks of Jewish protesters, for example, get erased, their movements dismissed as anti-Semitic, while the arrests disproportionately target them. And the media reports it, but no one calls out the deeper problem. The institutional anti-Semitism apparent and manifested recently in our policing. Then you've got laws cropping up to criminalize advocacy for Palestine, to make even displaying a Palestinian flag a punishable offense. And I can't help but think about how all of this echoes the same kind of oppression I've read about in Puerto Rican independence movements in history. Especially opposition to a national flag echoes the authoritarian response then and now. What's that they say about not remembering history and repeating it? It's all got me asking myself hard questions. For years, I celebrated milestones. The first Black woman Supreme Court justice, the possibility of a woman president, more women in leadership roles. But now, I'm sitting here wondering if I've been celebrating the wrong things. Are we really winning if the goal is to become one of the people propping up a corrupt system? Is success climbing to the top of a rigged game? Is it worth it to make it if it means compromising your principles along the way? I don't know. And honestly, I'm not here to tell anyone else how to feel or what to do. If you think you can work within this mess and fix it, I hope you're right. You do you. But me? I'm done. This system doesn't work. It's broken, and it's not going to let itself be dismantled from the inside. I mean, look at the last election. We had a choice between a fascist and a party that supported in real time and on live stream around the world what many have labeled genocide. U.S. whistleblowers came forward saying documents were altered to keep money and weapons flowing to Israel, even when international law experts were cataloging war crimes. And the administration's response? Denial, PR spin, and so many people bought it. The same people who praised whistleblowers during the previous administration under Donald Trump just shrugged. So what are we supposed to do when every nonviolent option for change is silenced or criminalized? When peaceful protest is met with state-sponsored violence, what's left? And honestly, I don't know if I even care about breaking glass ceilings in this system anymore. If the first woman president is just going to perpetuate the same oppression, is that a win? If the women rising to power are just proving they can out-patriarchy their male counterparts, what's there to celebrate? I can't do it anymore. But here's the thing. I'm not giving up on justice or on the people fighting for it. I'm just done with these hollow symbols of progress that serve the status quo. I don't want to prop up a system that thrives on injustice and corruption. I want to celebrate the people who truly stand up to power. The ones who take real risks and live by their convictions, even if it means they'll never be famous or celebrated in the mainstream. That's where my focus is now. Not on women billionaires, not on women CEOs, not women politicians who made it by playing the game, but on the people who refuse to play at all. The ones who stood apart, who stood up, who will never be on a history test in the United States, but should be. The women of the Black Panther Party are great examples. Women who provide a rich source of inspiration. Figures like Angela Davis, Assata Shakur, Elaine Brown, not only fought for racial justice, but also worked to challenge gender norms within revolutionary movements. They were unapologetic in their commitment to both Black liberation and the rights of women, often pushing back against sexism within the movement itself. Their activism, intelligence, and courage in the face of violent opposition offer a lot of material for reflection, especially if you're aiming to portray the complexities of women in revolution. They fought on multiple fronts against systemic racism, gender inequality, and state repression, much like the woman I'm going to talk about today, who, although from a different context, embodied similar resistance. On November 19, 1919, Gonzalo Lebrón Bernal and Rafaela Soto Luciano welcomed their daughter Lolita into the world. She was one of 5 children born to the couple and grew up in the town of Lorez, Puerto Rico. Her early years were spent in Hacienda Pezuelas, a barrio nestled within Lorez. Gonzalo supported the family as a foreman, earning a monthly income of $30, a figure that, at the time, was considered average for the role. Despite the modest earnings, the family managed to sustain themselves, and Lolita attended a small local school in her early years, but her childhood was marked by a serious bout of pneumonia. Her health never fully recovered, leaving her less physically active than her siblings. Instead, she found solace in quieter pursuits, often spending her time alone, surrounded by nature and tending to the family's food garden. The family eventually moved to another barrio in Lorez known as Mirasol, and with this change, Lolita transitioned to a larger public school. It was here that her education progressed until she completed the 8th grade, marking the end of her formal schooling. Though Gonzalo was an atheist, he adhered to the cultural expectations of the Catholic Church. All of his children were baptized and confirmed, and Lolita was no exception. At the age of 14, she took part in her confirmation ceremony. By then, her beauty had already drawn attention. Francisco Matos Paoli, a local poet 4 years her senior, became captivated by her. The two began a relationship not long afterward. Paoli would later rise to prominence as a writer and was even nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1977. His poetry was deeply intertwined with his political views and activism, making him a notable figure in Puerto Rico's cultural and political history. One of the defining moments in Puerto Rican politics during that time occurred in 1948 with the passage of a controversial bill in the Puerto Rican Senate. The Senate, dominated by the Partido Popular Democrático, or the PPD, introduced legislation that restricted the rights of independence and nationalist movements. The PPD, a party loyal to U.S. interests, opposed Puerto Rican independence and advocated for the island's status as a U.S. Commonwealth. The PPD remains a powerful force in Puerto Rican politics today and is closely aligned with the U.S. Democratic Party. Within the party, the majority of its members lean conservative, while a smaller liberal faction advocates for free association, an arrangement under which Puerto Rico would maintain a more flexible relationship with the United States. This model of free association is not without precedent, as it mirrors agreements the U.S. holds with Micronesia, the Marshall Islands, and Palau, collectively known as the Freely Associated States. The roots of the PPD can be traced to dissidents who opposed the Liberal Party of Puerto Rico, which championed independence. In 1948, the PPD introduced a bill that was eerily similar to the U.S. Smith Act of 1940. Both pieces of legislation were ostensibly aimed at criminalizing attempts to overthrow the government by force, but their application often diverged from these stated goals. Under the U.S. Smith Act, individuals were indicted for offenses such as being communists or socialists. Of the 215 people charged under this law, many saw their convictions overturned in 1957 when the U.S. Supreme Court declared portions of the act unconstitutional. Despite its lofty stated intentions, the law became a tool for suppressing political dissent. Even the New York Times at one point described elements of the act, such as the alien registration requirements, in critical terms, underscoring the gap between the law's purported aims and its real-world implications. Here's a quote. "The Alien Registration Act was merely one of many laws hastily passed in the first spasm of fear engendered by the success of fifth columns in less fortunate countries. Suddenly, the European war seemed almost at our doors, and who could tell what secret agents were already at work in America? So partly because some such bill would be adopted anyway, and partly because the step normally distasteful appeared inevitable, the administration sponsored the legislation." End of quote. In reality, the bill targeted anyone who opposed U.S. control of the island. The law made it illegal to print, publish, sell, or exhibit materials that challenged the U.S.-backed government. Organizing or assembling to promote opposition in your political views was outlawed, and patriotic songs about Puerto Rico could no longer be sung. Even displaying a Puerto Rican flag, a symbol of national identity, became a crime, punishable by up to 10 years in prison and hefty fines. Critics called it a repressive measure, and as noted earlier, decades later, the U.S. Supreme Court would deem similar laws unconstitutional for violating free speech. Paoli, the same man who had dated Lolita in her youth, rose to the rank of Secretary General of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party in 1949, and he became a direct target of these laws. The gag law, as it was commonly known, made his public advocacy for Puerto Rican independence a criminal act. Paoli's speeches took him across the island, rallying for freedom from the U.S. colonial rule. His defiance attracted the attention of authorities during a period of rising resistance, and in 1950, following nationalist uprisings, his home was raided by police searching for weapons. They found no arms or explosives, but they discovered a Puerto Rican flag. That was enough to arrest him on charges of treason. His crime? Possessing a flag and speaking out for self-determination. As a result, Paoli lost his position as a professor at the University of Puerto Rico, and he was sentenced to 20 years in prison, later reduced to only a decade. During his incarceration, he shared a cell with Pedro Albizu Campos, a lawyer and the president of the Nationalist Party, who himself had spent over 25 collective years in prison for his anti-imperialist work. Campos had been instrumental in organizing nationalist uprisings, which ultimately failed, and his party had also been implicated in a 1950 assassination attempt on President Harry Truman. It was this politically charged climate that shaped Lolita Lebrón formative years. She was just 14 years old when she and Paoli began their relationship despite opposition from both families. They continued to see each other and correspond even after Paoli moved away. But Lolita felt a strong sense of responsibility to her family and stayed behind, particularly to her father after he fell ill. She became his primary caregiver until his death, supporting herself through sewing and weaving. At the time, Lolita was a member of the Liberal Party and not yet deeply politically involved. However, that changed in 1937 when, at the age of 18, she was profoundly impacted by the Ponce massacre. During a peaceful nationalist protest, Puerto Rican police, under orders from U.S. appointed officials, opened fire on unarmed demonstrators, killing 19 people and wounding over 200. The event radicalized Lolita, marking the beginning of her shift toward nationalist ideology. Soon after, she entered a brief relationship with a local engineer, which resulted in the birth of a son. Unable to provide for her child at the time, she left the infant in the care of others and moved to New York in search of work. There, she witnessed firsthand the discrimination faced by Puerto Rican workers, which further entrenched her nationalist and labor-oriented views. She protested against this mistreatment and grew increasingly active in the fight for social and economic justice. In New York, Lolita joined the Puerto Rican Liberation Movement and pursued an education at George Washington College, where she studied for 2 years. She saw the struggles of newly arrived Puerto Rican laborers, many of whom lived in poverty, and their exploitation only fueled her growing activism. By 1946, she formally joined the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, immersing herself in the writings of Pedro Albizu Campos. However, she brought her own perspective to the movement, incorporating socialist and feminist ideals into her advocacy for labor rights and independence. During this time, she had another child, a daughter, who was also sent back to be raised in a safer situation in Puerto Rico. Lolita's precarious financial situation, single status, and activism made raising the child herself incredibly risky, if not completely logistically impossible. And as a result of her personal struggles while living and working in New York, she became especially focused on the rights and protections of women and children. Lolita quickly rose through the ranks of the party, serving as secretary, vice president, and eventually as the executive delegate for the New York delegation. By 1950, when the gag law in Puerto Rico had silenced nationalist voices and a fellow party member had been sentenced to death for involvement in the attempted assassination of Truman, Lolita threw herself into the defense effort. She joined a committee dedicated to commuting the sentence, and her determination contributed to its success. The death sentence was reduced, and Lolita's commitment to the cause deepened further, solidifying her role as a key figure in the Puerto Rican independence movement. Under U.S. imperial rule, a man named Luis Munoz Marin became Puerto Rico's first elected governor. Marin played a pivotal role in shaping the island's trajectory. Far from championing independence, though, Marin actively embraced U.S. capital and investment, aligning himself with the colonial power rather than advocating for self-governance. His long tenure as governor from 1949 to 1965 reinforced this alliance. In 1948, when Puerto Rico's Senate passed the gag law, the draconian legislation aimed to suppress the island's independence movement and the Nationalist Party. As head of the Senate, Marin was instrumental in its enactment, gaining expansive authority to arrest anyone suspected of nationalist sympathies. No evidence or due process was required. The law essentially criminalized dissent, silencing voices advocating for Puerto Rican freedom and sovereignty. In 1952, Puerto Rico's official status was rebranded as a U.S. Commonwealth, further entrenching its colonial relationship with the United States. By 1954, Lebrón received a letter from Campos, the Nationalist Party leader, outlining his plans for coordinated attacks on 3 symbolic locations as part of the independence movement. These plans signaled a shift from nonviolent resistance to more forceful measures, a shift born out of years of systemic repression. The oppressive environment created by these laws cannot be overstated. Peaceful protest was systematically crushed, and even cultural symbols like the Puerto Rican flag were banned. The search of Paoli's home, where his arrest hinged on possessing nothing more than a flag and delivering speeches, starkly illustrated the depth of systemic state violence. Such policies weren't just enforced by the U.S. Puerto Rican officials, including Marin, actively supported these measures, perpetuating a climate of fear and control. In this context, it's not hard to see how nonviolent resistance began to seem futile. When the government makes it clear that peaceful avenues for change will be met with prison sentences, fines, or worse, what options remain? For Lolita, witnessing persecution of someone as close to her as Paoli and seeing how even the most basic calls for cultural identity and autonomy were treated as treason must have driven home the hopelessness of relying on nonviolent approaches. It's a painful realization. The system isn't broken. It's working exactly as designed, to silence dissent and maintain control. For someone like Lolita, who already witnessed discrimination and injustice in Puerto Rico and in the U.S., the idea that force might be the only remaining language the government would acknowledge isn't hard to imagine. When peaceful resistance is met with laws like the gag law, when people are jailed for displaying a flag or singing patriotic songs, the message is clear. Dialogue is not on the table. In these circumstances, the shift toward violence doesn't emerge from a desire for destruction, but from a lack of alternatives. It becomes a calculated, albeit desperate means to force the oppressor to listen. It's easy to judge such actions from a distance, to frame them as unnecessary or extreme. But from Lolita's perspective, with every peaceful avenue stripped away and every act of defiance punished, violence might not have felt like a choice, but an inevitability. This isn't a justification for bloodshed, but an acknowledgement of how oppressive systems push people toward the margins, forcing them to fight back in the only way they believe might make a difference. The gag law and its U.S. counterparts served as more than just legal barriers. They were tools of erasure, designed to suffocate dissent and obliterate any hope for change. For someone like Lolita, who saw her community's voice systematically silenced, how could she not come to the conclusion that force was the only path forward? It's a grim reminder that when systems are built to crush dissent, they also pave the way for the very resistance they seek to prevent. I can't help but think of Martin Luther King Jr.'s words. Our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention." End quote. King advocated nonviolent resistance, but even he understood that state repression all but ensures violent response. In some ways, I wonder if the state doesn't actually count on this or relish it. Oppress people until they have no alternative but to become violent, then point and call them militants and extremists and terrorists. Drive them to self-defense, and when they act on it, paint them as the aggressor. We have done this throughout our entire U.S. history, and we continue that tradition against Palestine in its more recent iteration. But Campos, from his prison cell, had been corresponding with now 34-year-old Lebrón. He entrusted her with leading a group of Puerto Rican nationalists, Rafael Canchel Miranda, Irvin Flores, and Andre Figueroa Cordero to carry out an attack on key locations in Washington, D.C. Though the plan had Albizu's backing, Lebrón took it a step further, deciding to personally lead the mission even though no such order had been given. She carefully analyzed the strategy, pinpointing weaknesses, and ultimately concluded that a single concentrated assault on the House of Representatives would make the strongest statement. The date, March 1st, 1954, was deliberately chosen to coincide with the inauguration of the Conferencia Interamericana, the Inter-American Conference, in Caracas, ensuring the act would draw attention from Latin American nations. On the morning of the attack, Lebrón arrived at Grand Central Terminal and met the group. They traveled together to the United States Capitol, where they prepared to make history. Upon their arrival, Miranda hesitated, suggesting they delay the plan due to the rainy weather and the late hour. But Lebrón was unwavering and responded with resolute determination. "I am alone." She led the way into the building, her resolve undeterred, and the group followed. To them, this wasn't just a protest, but a revolutionary act, a coup d'etat they considered to be among the most significant moments in Puerto Rico's independence struggle. The group reached the visitors' gallery overlooking the chamber of the House of Representatives. Below, the lawmakers were engrossed in a discussion about Mexico's economy. The four nationalists took their seats, waiting for the right moment. Lebrón turned to her comrades and gave the order. They recited the Lord's Prayer together, then she stood, her voice cutting through the proceedings below as she shouted, "Viva Puerto Rico Libre!" Long live a free Puerto Rico. She unfurled the Puerto Rican flag, a symbol of defiance and identity, and the group opened fire with semi-automatic pistols. The scene descended into chaos. Lebrón later claimed that she aimed her shots at the ceiling, while Figueroa's weapon jammed. Miranda, according to his account, fired the majority of the 30 shots. 5 representatives were wounded in the attack, with Michigan Congressman Alvin Morrell Bentley sustaining a serious chest injury. As the police closed in and arrested them, Lebrón defiantly declared, "I did not come to kill anyone, I came to die for Puerto Rico." Her words resonated deeply, encapsulating the gravity of her convictions and the sacrifice she was willing to make for the cause of Puerto Rican independence. Lolita Lebrón and her group were charged with attempted murder and a host of other crimes following their attack on the U.S. Capitol. She was sent to the Federal Correctional Institute for Women in Alderaan, West Virginia, to await trial. On June 4, 1954, the trial began under strict security measures, overseen by Judge Alexander Holtzoff. The jury, consisting of 7 men and 5 women, was sworn to anonymity. Their identities were shielded from the public. The prosecution called 33 witnesses to testify against the group. In their defense, Ruth Mary Reynolds, known as the American Puerto Rican Nationalist, and her organization, the American League for Puerto Rico's Independence, advocated for Lebrón and her comrades. Despite this support, the defendants chose to testify on their own behalf, with Lebrón delivering a passionate reaffirmation of her cause, stating that she and her companions, quote, "came to die for the liberty of my homeland," unquote. During her 20-minute speech to the jury, she declared, quote, "I am being crucified for the freedom of my country," unquote. Throughout the trial, Lebrón remained composed, though she voiced her outrage when the defense introduced the possibility of mental instability to explain the group's actions. She also protested through her lawyers when the Puerto Rican flag presented as evidence was handled disrespectfully. And on June 16, 1954, the jury delivered its verdict. All 4 defendants were found guilty. The sentencing, however, was particularly devastating for Lebrón. On the morning of July 8th, just minutes before the hearing, she learned that her son had died. Judge Holtzoff sentenced all 4 defendants to the maximum terms allowed by law. Lebrón received a sentence ranging from 16 to 50 years depending on behavior. On July 13, 1954, the group was transported to New York, where they faced additional charges of conspiring to overthrow the United States government. On October 26, 1954, all were found guilty, which added 6 more years to their sentences. In total, Lebrón was sentenced to 50 years in prison. The early years were particularly harrowing for her. She struggled with the compound grief of losing both her son and her mother while enduring the isolation of incarceration. At first, no contact with the outside world was permitted, but after a 3.5-day hunger strike organized by inmates, communication rights were granted. Lebrón's participation in the protest led to restrictions on her privileges and barred her from working outside her cell for a time. Eventually, though, she was assigned to work in the prison infirmary. During her incarceration, Lebrón was offered parole multiple times on the condition that she issue a public apology for her actions. Each time, she indignantly refused. After serving 15 years, her social worker suggested she apply for parole, but she showed no interest and refused to sign the necessary paperwork. This prompted the prison to mandate her attendance at a meeting with a penitentiary committee. There she presented a written statement explaining her position on the parole proposal and expounding on broader topics like terrorism, politics, and the United States' use of the atomic bomb. In 1977, Lebrón's daughter Gladys passed away while Lebrón remained behind bars. The loss further cemented her resolve to endure her sentence with dignity and unwavering commitment to the cause she had fought for. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter commuted the sentences of Lolita Lebrón, Irvin Flores, and Rafael Cancel Miranda after they had served 25 years in prison. Andre Figueroa Cordero had been released earlier due to a terminal illness. The decision to commute their sentences was met with public opposition from Puerto Rico's then-governor, Carlos Romero Barceló, who argued that it would encourage terrorism and compromise public safety. Nevertheless, Lebrón returned to Puerto Rico to a heroine's welcome from her supporters. After her release, Lebrón married Sergio Irizarry Rivera, whom she had met while in prison. He had been tasked by the Nationalist Party to monitor her health during her incarceration, and eventually he became her partner in life. 8 years after their initial meeting, the couple married and moved into a modest house in Loiza. The home reflected Lebrón's deeply held beliefs, adorned with religious iconography and dominated by a large Puerto Rican flag in the living room. In that same year of her release, Lebrón, along with her comrades, was celebrated at the International Conference in Support of Independence for Puerto Rico, held in Mexico City. Representing the ideals of their mentor, Campos, they were honored for their sacrifice and courage before the delegates from 51 countries. Despite her advancing age, Lebrón remained active in the independence movement. That same year, Lebrón lent her voice to the protests against the U.S. Navy's presence in Vieques. She testified at the International Tribunal on Violations of Human Rights in Puerto Rico in Vieques, earning applause as she declared her pride in leading the 1954 attack on the U.S. Congress. Her activism led to her arrest on June 26, 2001, after trespassing in a restricted area of Vieques. Sentenced to 60 days in prison, she served 37 additional days after her initial arrest. Less than 2 years later, on May 1, 2003, the U.S. Navy withdrew from Vieques, turning its facilities over to the Puerto Rican government. Lebrón continued her activism opposing the Democratic Party's primary in 2008 and advocating for Puerto Rico's sovereignty. Her health began to decline in her later years, and on August 1, 2010, Lolita Lebrón passed away, leaving behind a legacy of activism and unwavering dedication to Puerto Rican independence. Her death was mourned by political leaders and supporters, with her life celebrated in Puerto Rico and abroad. In spite of the reality that most U.S. students will never hear her name or even know about the Capitol attack in which she participated, she received numerous international homages and a few within the U.S. domestically throughout the years, including paintings, books, and even a documentary. One of the most notable tributes came from Mexican artist Octavio Ocampo, who created a poster of Lebrón that was displayed at the Galeria de la Raza in San Francisco, California. In Chicago's Humboldt Park, a mural depicting Lebrón, among other prominent Puerto Ricans, became a focal point of cultural celebration. Additionally, Lebrón became a popular subject in silkscreen art, with one of the most acclaimed pieces being Linda Lucero's Lolita Lebrón, Viva Puerto Rico Libre. Lucero, who was drawn to learning about the political prisoners in the United States, saw Lebrón as an ideal subject for a poster symbolizing community and resistance. Living in San Francisco's Mission District, where the Puerto Rican population was small, Lucero's decision to depict Lebrón was seen as surprising. What made the work particularly striking was Lucero's decision to render Lebrón in burnt sienna, emphasizing her brown skin, a significant departure from how Puerto Ricans commonly viewed her as a white woman. The poster portrayed Lebrón as a contemplative, suffering figure, which some scholars interpreted as symbolizing a, quote, radicalized colonial subject suffering at the hands of imperial power, unquote. This portrayal contrasted sharply with how the U.S. media often depicted her as a femme fatale. The silkscreen became widely recognized and is now housed in the Smithsonian American Art Museum. Another silkscreen of Lebrón, created by Marcos Dimas, also resides in the Smithsonian collection. Unlike Lucero's somber depiction, Dimas presented Lebrón in more heroic light. In this piece, her eyes are defiantly raised in a three-quarter profile, staring ahead with determination. The image is repeated 4 times on the poster with the words Puerto Rican freedom fighter emblazoned across it. This portrayal was celebrated by scholars as an empowering depiction of Lebrón, a stark contrast to the media's portrayal of her as a terrorist, often sensationalized with headlines like "When Terror Wore Lipstick." In Puerto Rico, Lebrón's contributions were honored with a plaque at the monument dedicated to the participants of the Ayuya uprising in Mayaguez. Her name is prominently featured on the first line of the third plate, celebrating her role in the Nationalist Party. Her story has also been documented in literature. Her granddaughter, Irene Villar, wrote The Ladies' Gallery, a memoir of family secrets, which delves into the complexities of her relationship with Lebrón. In the book, Villar portrays her grandmother as a distant, larger-than-life figure whose presence casts a long shadow over the family, one that Villar still grapples with. However, Villar's perspective on her grandmother softened after the devastation caused by Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. Reflecting on Lebrón's words about Puerto Ricans needing to feed themselves to truly have sovereignty, Villar felt compelled to act. She, along with Tara Rodriguez-Besosa, started the Resilience Fund to aid farmers who lost everything in the storm. Villar appealed for donations of seeds, receiving an overwhelming response which enabled her to help save farms and support the livelihoods of farmers across Puerto Rico. Lolita Lebrón's life and legacy are a powerful testament to the relentless fight for Puerto Rican independence, marked by both sacrifice and controversy. From her early activism and imprisonment to her eventual release and continued involvement in the independence cause, she became a symbol of resistance and determination. Her story has been immortalized through art, literature, and public memorials, as well as in the powerful voices of those who continue to champion her cause. While her actions were often met with harsh criticism, particularly from those who viewed her through the lens of U.S. imperialism, Lebrón's courage and conviction in the pursuit of freedom remain undeniable. Even as her legacy remains complex with moments of personal and familial tension, it's clear that Lolita Lebrón will always be remembered as a staunch defender of Puerto Rico's sovereignty and an enduring icon of political activism. That's it for this episode of At Home in My Head, exploring experience and meaning in individuals and the broader society. Like and subscribe if you enjoy these talks, and in the meantime, stay safe, be well, and never stop exploring.